Tonight I'd like to continue our discussion of chapter 12 of the Gospel of Matthew. In this section of Matthew, we see a sort of a back and forth between Jesus and some of the religious authorities, and they're disputing about the Sabbath and how Jesus is observing the Sabbath or not observing the Sabbath. And Jesus is in certain ways trying to instruct them on the proper understanding of the Sabbath. Take a look at chapter 12, starting in verse 9, and it is the story of a man who has a withered hand. So this poor fellow has been having problems with his hand. In verse 9, it says that Jesus, moving on from there, he went into their synagogue, which is very interesting. We see Jesus doing a lot of his ministry actually in synagogues. Again, showing the Jewish roots of Jesus and how thoroughly Jesus is comfortable in a Jewish setting. And in verse 10 it says, "Behold, there was a man there who had a withered hand. They questioned him, 'Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?' So they might accuse him." We don't know who the they is, but they're questioning Jesus. Well, there's a fellow there. He's got a withered hand. Is it okay to cure on the Sabbath? In a way, it seems like they've heard about some of this controversy that Jesus has been involved with, and they're trying to snag him in it. Rabbinic tradition, later than the Gospels, allowed relief to be given to the sufferer if the person's life was in danger. So if a person's life was in danger, that was fine on the Sabbath, but if it wasn't in danger, just keep the Sabbath. This might have also been the view of the Pharisaic contemporaries of Jesus, that they would have had a similar view that, if it's not a life-threatening thing, just hold off to a day or two and, do it on another day, but don't do it on the Sabbath. So Jesus in verse 11 says to him, "Well, now, which of you who has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath will not take hold of it and lift it out?" So Jesus really gets into it. Well, what if you have a sheep, and you're trying to take care of the sheep, it falls into a pit, and it, wouldn't you lift it out on the Sabbath? And Jesus is trying to argue here from the lesser to the greater. Rabbinical practice attested to in the Talmud allowed a person to render assistance to an animal that was in distress on the Sabbath. So this was allowed. You could help that animal. Sabbath, no problem. That was the Talmudic tradition, that this was allowed. So Jesus gets into it with them, and in verse 12 says, "Well, how much more valuable is a person than the sheep?" I mean, look at you've got a person here, you've got a sheep. Isn't the person more valuable than the sheep? You can help the sheep. Why can't you help the person? Jesus is saying. So then he says, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath?" So Jesus takes it a step further, not only in terms of the sheep and the person. You're doing something good. It's the Sabbath, but you're doing something that is a good thing. And shouldn't you be doing good things all the time, but especially on the Sabbath? Just because it's the Sabbath doesn't excuse you from helping people and doing good, right? Well, the rabbinical practice, the practice that the rabbis preferred, would have been to postpone treatment until the day after the Sabbath. And say, wait a day. What's the big deal? Fellow's had the withered hand for a long time. Hang on, wait a day. It is very similar to our practice, where we try to avoid treatments and surgeries on a Sunday. We usually use other days. If it's an emergency, of course, it's done on a Sunday, but when they schedule surgeries, they do it on a different day. Then in verse 13, then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored as sound as the other. So Jesus lays it out there. He says, it's good. We can do good on the Sabbath. Why not do good? You're taking care of the sheep. Why not take care of a person? For the Pharisees, the key point would have been if the illness would have brought the man close to death. Withered hand, not that type of issue. It's not a life and death situation. So the Pharisees would have said, hold on. Jesus says, no, we can do good on the Sabbath. And then in verse 14 it says, but the Pharisees went out and took counsel against him to put him to death. So we have the Pharisees. They're not too happy with the situation. And it's funny, this action is attributed to the Pharisees alone, and this might have been due to the conflict between the Pharisees and Matthew's community. So we see this in Matthew, that there are these conflict stories between Jesus and the Pharisees, and even the apostles and the Pharisees get into it. And so the idea is, well, maybe within Matthew's community there was this tension. And so Matthew is trying to address this in terms of his community. And certainly the big revision here for this has to be that the Pharisees in general, wonderful people, many of the Pharisees followed Jesus. Pharisees did a lot of good. We can't, label the Pharisees as all bad or say negative things about them. We just, in terms of this situation, Jesus is pointing out something. He's saying that we can do good on the Sabbath. You're helping animals on the Sabbath. Help a human being. What's the big deal? It's not a major issue here. The fellow is here right now. Maybe, tomorrow I'm off someplace else. I don't see him. I don't encounter him. And he still has to deal with this withered hand. Why not do it right here and now? It's not a huge thing where I'm doing a tremendous amount of labor to violate the Sabbath in any way. So Jesus is clear in his intention, but the reaction of the Pharisees is very strong. They want to put Jesus to death. So this is an indication that Jesus is in trouble fairly early on in his ministry here. That we're only in chapter 12, so Jesus is certainly on notice here that there's going to be some problems in terms of his reception by the religious authorities of his day. And you can see because he's kind of challenging them, isn't he? He's kind of saying things that and doing things that possibly could aggravate them. We go on then in chapter 12 to this next section, which is the section called the chosen servant, verses 15 to 21. Verse 15, when Jesus realized this, so Jesus is sensing this, that something's afoot here with the religious authorities, maybe the Pharisees, the scribes, others, part of the Sanhedrin, the official governing body. He's in trouble here, and he senses it, knows it. So he withdrew from that place. So this is time to get out. I don't want to continue to be in a situation of danger, possibly. I'm going to opt out here and get away from here. Many people followed them, and he cured them all. And it doesn't say whether he cured them on the Sabbath or not, but he's still doing this healing ministry. And it's many people that he's curing. So there is a plot against him. The plot has to do with his healing ministry, and when he does heal, Jesus doesn't seem to worry about it at all. He's like, I'm still going to cure. That's what my ministry is about. It's a ministry of healing. But then in the second part, here in verse 16, it says, but he warned them not to make him known. So Jesus is conscious of the fact that, don't talk a lot about this. Jesus obviously does not want to aggravate the authorities. The authorities are having problems with him enough. That's great. I don't want to make the situation worse. No aggravation here. And they're plotting against him, so why give them more material? verse 17, this was to fulfill what was been spoken through Isaiah the prophet. The quotation is from Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 to 4. It is the longest quotation from the Hebrew scriptures in Matthew. And it emphasizes really the meekness of Jesus. He is portrayed as the servant of the Lord. And it also foretells the extension of his ministry to the Gentiles. It's not just going to be limited to the Jewish people, it's going to be for the Gentiles as well. So the quotation, "Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom I delight. I shall place my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles." This quotation from Isaiah, which we will explore further, really kind of sets the stage for what Jesus is about. His spirit, the Spirit of God, is going upon him, and he's going to proclaim justice. And it's not just going to be limited to the Jewish people; it's also going to be to the Gentiles. So we'll see how Jesus handles this situation and how he furthers the mission of proclaiming the good news.